All right. We are live in the LCI Greenroom where we are open and unscripted, and we like to debate, talk about things, have open conversations. And I am joined today. I am the host of tonight's discussion slash debate slash brawl. I don't know what it'll become. We'll find out. I am joined by Jacob Winograd and Jack Lloyd, two fellow fighters in the cause for liberty who disagree about something, and we want to talk about it because it's a really, really important topic. Jacob Winograd is host of the Biblical Anarchy podcast, and that's part of the Christians for Liberty Network, which is part of what you're watching and listening to right now. And Jack Lloyd is a multimedia content producer in the Liberty Movement whose work spans fiction, nonfiction, with educational videos, music videos, skits, comic book series, and all kinds of jokes about him and his wife on social media that we get to enjoy. So follow Jack Lloyd on all the channels. Jack and Jacob, thank you for joining us here. You know, we're really talking about something that's pretty important, that's been on a lot of people's minds, and that is, what is the libertarian response to Israel's war in Gaza? And there's like a million different takes on this. Some of them are from libertarians that don't sound libertarian. Some of them are from non-libertarians who actually sound libertarian. And so there's just a lot of noise out there. And, you know, the Libertarian Christian Institute, we want to cut through some of that noise, and we want to bring the truth to people. And I think there's no better set of people to discuss some of these things than the two of you. So I really appreciate both of you being on here. As much as we're going to sort of put a little bit of structure to this conversation, it's going to be open-ended to a degree, but we're going to do the formal, you know, start off with, you know, formal remarks and do some rebuttals, and then get into the Q&A, especially if we have live stream people sending in some questions near the end. We'll do that. So there will be time for people to submit questions either to both of you or to just one of you for whatever reason that is. Basically, we are going to start off with a 10-minute opening remark. I'm going to put Jack up on here first. What is, Jack, what is the proper libertarian response to Israel's war in Gaza?
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. For me, this topic is kind of special because it ties back to my own family's history and upbringing, because my family, they were Messianic, and the topic of Israel was often discussed in a hot button issue growing up. For some people, it's a new topic, and it's something that's not really, close to home for them, and it only pops up in the media cycle. But for me, my family has been to Israel, some of them multiple times. Family's done birthright and things like that. So I have this kind of backdrop to the situation where I've seen things going on, more immediately to myself from hearing my own family stories and things going on there. And when I talk about this situation, I always keep it in a libertarian context, right? Because we're talking about issues abroad and conflicts and things like that. It's sometimes hard to stay focused on the question of property rights and escalations of violence and, who's doing what, especially in a region that's had so many different people fight over it for millennia. So, the two things I really want to get through to people are, first and foremost, what is actually in your control as an individual? Because I know a lot of times people get caught up in these issues and they debate about them. They're like, oh, if you don't say this language about the situation, you're a genocide denier and all this other stuff. But let's be real about what most people are and what they do. They're just talking online. None of their blogs, none of their news articles have saved a single life. They have not stopped Israel from doing any bombings. They have not stopped Hamas. So a lot of times it's just flag and bio virtue signaling that people are doing. They're not actually saving anybody's lives by complaining in and of itself. So that's important to remember. And then when we're talking about the situation, where we're describing the situation, the question should be, are we advocating for something that gets people to be principled and consistent toward the ends of a libertarian order, right? We don't want to, when thinking about the situation, shift from one type of criticism of statism to a new form of, oh, we're accepting this other form of statism, right? And that's often lost in the discourse, because whenever there's children dying and there's, bombings and suicide bombings and things like that, it's very easy for people to get lost in it. Just like with the gun control debate, right? People will say, well, think of the children, and they're all shot up in school shootings. And it's very easy to have your heartstrings pulled and then lose sight of, okay, well, how did this, come to be? So going to the question of how did this all come to be, we have to remember that people who are currently in the land of Israel today have long histories and different perspectives and backgrounds depending on where they came from. And the impetus specifically for Israel came out of fleeing persecution, right? So just like the American experience, where people were fleeing Britain because they didn't want to be persecuted for their Christian beliefs against the Church of England, against the Catholic Church, they came to America, Puritans, Quakers, and the like. They came over to the New World because they wanted freedom of religion and they wanted a sanctuary for themselves. Jews were also coming to the region for the same purposes. They had faced persecution across Europe, not just in Nazi Germany, but in other countries as well, being kept out of professions, being quartered into ghettos. And eventually, got to a point where Jews were like, okay, we need a place that is safe away from all this persecution, especially, things like where the Spanish, 1492, kicking out nearly 100,000 Jews from Spain. So it's a serious situation. So they wanted refuge, much like anybody else who's fleeing persecution or tough situations. Of course, in the land, there were some people there, certainly, including Jews who are already existing there. And the contention people have in this is whether or not there was this type of generalized right to land and whether everything was already homesteaded. And so, when you look at the actual land map, going back, and this is not even perfectly accurate, but it's kind of just a sense of it, you can already see that most of the land back then was obviously not physically and directly homesteaded, right? We're libertarians. The first question is who has property rights to what and how did they develop it? And the reason why it wasn't very homesteaded was in part because the Ottoman Empire didn't exactly have the best of property rights rules. With their Ottoman land code, they had this thing called the Musha system, where different agricultural farmers, they couldn't actually homestead what they were, grazing and doing crops over, because there'd be this lottery system. People would draw lots every up to 9 years, where they would have to trade off the land. And the Ottoman Empire was also causing people to become impoverished because of conscription. So men were being carted off and forced to fight. And then other lands were being held by absentee landowners. So we're talking about people who are in Damascus and Syria and stuff like that, who are rich. They had crony deals with the Ottomans. And these very poor farmers, the fellaheen, they would, often be in some type of debt, whether it was a tax debt or a kind of feudalism with these people where they would never really be able to own the land, and they were very poor. And being in a desert region, obviously things were tough. There was economic conditions that went up and down because of bad weather and famines and all types of things, plagues, birds dying. It wasn't fun. People would move in and out of these regions to different countries, surrounding, of course, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, stuff like that, depending on the seasons and depending on economic activities. And some of this was recorded as well and noted about by the British. They did a survey of the mandate and they did some reporting, and they noted that there were certain types of, by their standards, illegal immigration, which kind of hard to measure, back with their technology, but they had their own forms of borders and checkpoints back then too with the British, because the British and the police there, managed things. So obviously, over time, with the Jewish National Fund and getting people over there, more and more Jews started to come in. This is way before Israel, right? Eventually, it got to a point where there was, significant Israeli settlements or Jewish settlements, in pre-Israel. So obviously, people were feeling tense about that. In the same way that some people felt tense about Black people moving into white neighborhoods in America. And they're like, oh my gosh, how dare they move, close to us? And some people would kick up animosity, like al-Husseini, who, start up riots against Jews and would have them come and hurt, Jewish businesses and attack people. So eventually, of course, this all started to come to a head, especially after World War II. There's this big nationalism drive everywhere, because after the big world wars, things were getting redrawn around the world. Nationalism very strong, and people were, basically resetting the boundaries of global politics. And so Israel was one of those creations out of that. And they were not unique. The British and the French, they were also crafting out their little, different redrawings of the map, breaking up the Ottoman Empire that became Turkey. And, for example, Syria was created out of it. Pakistan was created out of it, which created this huge conflict between the Muslims and the Sheiks and the Hindus. There's like 14 million people, 15 million about displaced. 1 million people were killed in the conflicts. Pretty bloody. And, that is just typical for what happens when the governments are picking the winners and losers and just drawing boundaries, and then people hate each other over it. It's not unique to there. Africa had that too with the scramble for Africa after the Berlin Conference. That's the nature of statism. So Israel is not special in that way. And a lot of people want to make Israel special and say, oh, these people are these occupiers and they move people out and all this sort of stuff. Sure, just like most every other country, like the United States kicked out the Native Americans, like they kicked out Mexicans, millions of them between the Mexican-American War, from 1846, 48, and then the Treaty of Guadalupe, and then Operation Wetback. 1.3 million Mexicans were kicked out, many who were naturalized. And of course, some people be like, oh, well, we need to build a border wall for them, right? And of course, they don't care about Mexicans coming back in after getting kicked out because that doesn't fit their narrative, their selfish narrative, wanting to have security for themselves, but not for others. So there's a big philosophical conundrum here where people are trying to demonize Israel uniquely, but failing to see the broader global picture. And so it's just, for me, a matter of bringing it back down to basics. What are we trying to communicate to others? And in that end, we're trying to communicate that we want to have a libertarian order, which means we want to promote de-escalation of conflict. We don't want Israel blowing up hospitals and stuff like that and having kids die. But again, Hamas has built tunnel networks under there, and they're shooting rockets and killing Jews as well. So you can't sit there and say and play, two sides and just ignore that, those things are happening. You have to sit there and go, okay, there are serious casualties from people fighting this war, and something bigger is needed to solve this. And that bigger thing is in the realm of ideas. It is about moving away from the collectivism, the statism, and the religious fanaticism. Doesn't matter whether it's on the Zionist side, doesn't matter if it's on the Hamas Islamic side. If the goal is to cause more damage and to hurt people, we should be against that. We should be looking for peace. We should be looking for solutions that involve discrete property rights. And those things can be done if we get rid of the big collectivist language and all or nothing thinking. And we start to realize what the situation is in many of these places, which is a lot of broken agreements by radical fundamentalist Islamists who don't want to see Israel there whatsoever. They won't settle for that. Yasser Arafat was definitely against that in 2000. And until there is that de-escalation of that ideology, we won't, get to peace. So that's kind of a small summary of it all. There's definitely a lot more details I can get into, especially on the language that people use. But I just want that to be the main focal word: restitution, property rights, and things like that.
All right. Excellent. Thank you, Jack. Jacob, I'm going to let you have your 10 minutes, and then we're going to be followed by some Did I Hear You Right segment.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks. All right, so the question that we are answering today and centering our discussion around is what the libertarian response should be towards the war in Gaza. We as libertarians value property rights and voluntary interactions. I think to go further, war and statism are forces that violate property rights and voluntary interactions. I think to go further, we should always strive to understand what forces are driving both wars and the generation and sustainment of states. We're all, I think, ANCAPs here, so we're in agreement there. We should understand from a Misesian or Austrian, economic sense that when states act in the economy, it creates distortions in the market. When it uses military force or military operations in ways that don't adhere to the non-aggression principle, respecting self-ownership and rejecting the initiation of force as a violation of the former, it similarly creates distortions in the market of human relationships. These distortions create bubbles that burst in similar ways to when, what happens when the market crashes with economic interventions. We often label these bursting bubbles when people push back predictably against state military operations, blowback. This was one of the lessons that Ron Paul taught us and woke many Americans up to the truth of America's involvement in the Middle East for decades, which led to September 11th, which was the blowback of America's continual presence in interventions in the Middle East. So my contention is that the situation in Israel isn't fundamentally different. It's a situation of historical aggressions by often state actors that led to a tipping point where violence escalated from the victims, blowback as I've described it. there's usually no issue when applying these principles to the American government and its military operations and foreign policy. At least within libertarian circles, we all generally agree on this. However, there is a decent number of libertarians who have reservations about applying this framework to Israel, or who believe that many of the criticisms of Israel historically and in this current conflict are either overstating the case of state aggression, understating the violence or the responsibility of the Palestinians or Hamas or other actors in the Middle East, or, and I've heard Jack say this in some of the podcasts I've heard from him when he's talking about this subject, believe that some of us in the libertarian movement are not applying an actual libertarian framework when we're criticizing Israel, but that we're being influenced by either like a leftist or Marxist or some fundamentally anti-Western framework rather than, property rights and non-aggression principle. Jack's been, pretty critical, I think, of people at the Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, other prominent voices in the movement as well, kind of launching those criticisms. If I were, I know we're going to do this later, but I already had this in my intro. If I were to steelman Jack's arguments, as I read and heard them, it's all of what I said above. And to add to that, his position is that while Israel has a state and all states violate liberty and individual rights, too many libertarians are making Israel out to be a great evil force in the world or the greatest force of evil in the world, while providing cover to the evils present in extremist Islamic groups and countries. So I disagree with Jack, assuming I've characterized his positions accurately, and we'll find out when we get to the nice little part of the discussion that Doug has planned for us. But I'm going to go on what I believe is true and that I think does adhere to libertarian principles and ethics. So I got 3 main points here. The first point would be what history shows us is that Israel and Zionists have been the overall, doesn't mean that in 100% of situations they are, but the overall initiators of aggression and thus the ones who are, causing blowback, and that this cycle can be traced through the events preceding and then following October 7th. Even leaving the history aside, because we could go back and forth on the history all day long, and that might not necessarily be the focus of this conversation, although I'm happy to talk about history, but there's just so much to cover. It could, we could do 4 or 5, 10 hours or more on that. But even just focusing on the recent history of present day paints a bad picture for the state of Israel, as it seems to demonstrate that October 7th was blowback for specific policies of the Netanyahu administration, and that these policies were simultaneously enforcing what I would call concentration camp-like conditions in Gaza, while intentionally empowering Hamas to stay in power and to halt progress towards peace. And then my third point is that Israel is assisted largely by the United States government, and the state of Israel's influence over United States politics has a lot to do with the violence and the wars going on in the Middle East and elsewhere, both in the past and today. And so it makes perfect sense for libertarians to give Israel special attention and criticism while still calling out those other conflicts and acts of aggression going on in the world. So let's go point by point here. The first point with the history, again, I'm going to try to breeze through this. Jack gave his, little summary of the history there. There was parts that I agreed with, parts I disagreed with. Certainly Zionism was born of, a reaction to anti-Semitism and pogroms going on often in Eastern Europe, but even in Western Europe, there were tensions and things, places that they thought they were safe that they ended up not being. And so again, there's a lot there, but we're going to skim over that. If we go past the late 1800s and go to the early 1900s, and we talk about tracking through World War I, World War II, and into the creation of Israel today, I think what we find if we look at all that is that there was these different factions within Zionism. There were practical Zionists, there were moderate Zionists, and there were more radical Zionists. And I think that over time, what I see when I look at what's reported throughout history is that the radical Zionists over time won the soul of Zionism, and they became the primary leaders and movers in the Zionist movement. And these radical Zionists from the beginning, and only becoming more committed with time, were devoted to an exclusive Jewish state in Palestine, or Israel proper as we know it today. This was exacerbated by a lot of things, by the Balfour Declaration and Britain making more promises than they could ever keep during World War I, promising the Arabs independence and never delivering on it. You have evidence of Zionists instigating tensions in the Nebi Musa report, for example. And to be fair, there were times that the Arabs committed violence too. But I think, again, looking at that cycle of blowback and whatnot, people coming in, I think we have to contextualize that. Not that they're angels, but they're reacting to human incentives. By 1944 through 1947, then, the Zionists have built up militias, and they've already begun revolting against Britain. To say that the Palestinians just left and weren't forced out, I think it's ahistorical, and certainly many have traceable property right claims that were violated after the establishment of the State of Israel, and then taking of more territory in 1967. We can see, and there are quotes galore from Israeli officials themselves, and I have a lot of them on hand if we want to get into that later in the debate. But a lot of quotes, show that the intention was to push these people out to create their majority Jewish ethnic state. That they didn't kick all the Arabs out, I think that wasn't for a lack of trying and a desire to do so on behalf of the Zionist leaders. I'll end there on the history. I'm sure later in the conversation we might go back and forth on a few of these things. Like I said, I don't think it's even necessary to win on just the history, but I think understanding some of this history is important and gives some context to some of the feelings that I think the Palestinians have towards Israel. But my second point, and I'm going to spend a lot of my time here, the recent history to present day still paints a bad picture for the state of Israel. And it seems easy to demonstrate that October 7th was blowback for the specific policies of the Netanyahu administration. And these policies were simultaneously enforcing what I would call like concentration camp-like conditions in Gaza, while intentionally empowering Hamas to stay in power to halt progress towards peace. This claim is best supported by a piece that Scott Horton and Connor Freeman wrote on antiwar.com entitled Netanyahu's Support for Hamas Backfired. To summarize everything here, a staggering number of human rights organizations have described Gaza as being like a concentration camp or open-air prison since the end of the 1967 war. I know Jack has disagreements with that language. We can talk about that later. Since then, the Palestinians have been denied having their own sovereignty or being included in some kind of, universal state or binational state with equal rights being guaranteed and protected in all these different territories. What's worse is that we know that Hamas's creation was assisted by Israel and the state of Israel, and then Hamas was put into power largely by the actions of the state of Israel and the United States as well. Well, why is that? Israel has historically used Hamas to counterbalance the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and to prevent the unification of Palestinian territories under a more moderate leadership. Initially, Israel supported Hamas to dilute the PLO's influence. PLO is a little bit more secular, a little bit less in the religious extremist territory. Although in the past PLO's committed terrorism and things like that, they've become much more moderate as time goes on. Being willing to go back to 1967 borders and things like that. But so Israel supported Hamas to dilute the PLO's influence. They provided indirect financial support and then they were allowing the establishment of institutions that later became extremist hubs. This strategy was aimed at dividing Palestinian support and maintaining control over the peace process by ensuring that no viable partner for peace negotiations emerged from the Palestinian side, specifically in Gaza. CIA officials confirmed this, and this is also bolstered by the fact that Bibi himself, by Bibi I mean Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as other Israeli officials, have been quoted as saying that they supported Hamas for the purpose of dividing the Palestinians and opposing efforts aimed at peace or a Palestinian state. After Camp David 2000 failed and the Second Intifada happened, which was largely kind of a result of that failure, Likud Party Prime Minister Ariel Sharon initiated a policy known as disengagement in the Gaza Strip. Many point to this and they're like, see, they ended the occupation in 2005. It's really not that simple. Israel did remove a lot of, thousands of settlers and their military forces from being there in Gaza. However, the Israeli army was redeployed in the areas surrounding Gaza, and the goal here wasn't peace. It was to kill the peace process, and with it, any hopes the Palestinians had for a future state. Sharon's senior advisor, Dov Weissglass, said the significance of the disengagement plan is the freezing of the peace process. And when you freeze that process, you prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. And you prevent a discussion on the refugees, the borders, and Jerusalem. Effectively, this whole package called the Palestinian state, with all that it entails, has been removed indefinitely from our agenda. And all this with a U.S. presidential blessing and the ratification of both houses of Congress, you know, we have their support. This disengagement is actually formaldehyde. It supplies the amount of formaldehyde that is necessary so that there will not be a political process with the Palestinians. The disengagement plan makes it possible for Israel to park conveniently in an interim situation that distances us as far as possible from political pressure. It legitimizes our contention that there is no negotiating with the Palestinians. We educated the world to understand that there is no one to talk to. One, we have a no one to talk to certificate, and that certificate says, one, there's no one to talk to. As long as there's no one to talk to, the geographic status quo remains intact. And three, the certificate will only be revoked when this and this happens, when Palestine becomes Finland. See you then, and shalom. Military Intelligence Director Amos Yadlin commented on June 13th, 2007, that Israel would be happy if Hamas took over Gaza because the IDF could then deal with Gaza as a hostile state. He also dismissed Iran's influence over Hamas. Interestingly, as long as they don't have a port, he said, it's something Israel can handle. There's evidence that Israel and the U.S. helped or contribute to Hamas winning the 2006 elections, in which they then seized control over the Gaza Strip. And then it's just well-known fact, despite official denials of this, that Netanyahu continually worked to make sure money could be funneled into Gaza to support Hamas specifically. If Hamas was so bad, couldn't Israel, and this is a question I want you to ask, if Hamas is so bad, why didn't Israel and the U.S. push for another election? Condoleezza Rice insisted on these elections. Hamas takes over, and it's clear this was the goal. There are more quotes, again, supporting this claim that this was the strategy of the Likud and Bibi himself. So this is a quote from Netanyahu. Anyone who wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state has to support bolstering Hamas and transferring money to Hamas. This is part of our strategy to isolate the Palestinians in Gaza from the Palestinians in the West Bank. It is impossible to reach an agreement with them. Everyone knows this, but we control the height of the flames. Well, I would say they did not control the height of the flames, and October 7th is just blowback for this policy. I have a lot of other quotes supporting this that I could go through. I'm going to skip over this for now. We can go back to them later if Jack wants to hear some more of them, or if the audience wants to. Keeping all this in mind, there were escalations of violence from Israel in Gaza and in the West Bank leading up to October 7th. The Abraham Accords were a major factor because it was essentially, bribing the Arab nations to make peace with Israel in spite of what Israel was doing with the Palestinians. I can provide more on that later if it comes up. October 7th comes, Hamas launches its attack. Now keep in mind, Israel, and this has come out recently too, Israel has been warned for over a year now through Egypt and others that Hamas is planning something. We can touch on more of that later. I want to make this clear. I have no issue condemning Hamas's attack. I'm in a very similar situation to Jack. My dad was for most of his life a Messianic Jew or converted Jew. Most of my family is Jewish. My grandmother spent years in Israel and whatnot. And so I grew up in a very, Zionist, pro-Israel, household. I don't hate Israel, don't hate its people. As a libertarian, I abhor violence. And so, Hamas's actions were horrible. And I'm not here to provide cover for Hamas one bit. In fact, I'll say this, for peace to be achieved, Hamas has to go, but so do the Likud and the radical Zionists. Hamas's actions must be condemned and understood as blowback from a desperate and occupied people. And as much as we condemn Hamas, we ought to at least just as much, if not possibly more, condemn the IDF. As bad as October 7th was, there was some haze of war and some propaganda and outrage porn going around regarding the events of that day. And as more facts get reported, certain narratives need to be dropped or amended. We should only report on what is true, what can be established with evidence. Many of the Israeli civilians and soldiers who died that day were not killed by Hamas, but by Israeli forces themselves. both as a result of friendly fire and a controversial military policy known as the Hannibal Directive. This policy dictates that it's better for Israel to kill its own soldiers or civilians rather than allow an enemy to take them captive. In addition to that, Israeli forces used heavy weapons, including attack helicopters, tanks, armed drones, to bomb military bases and residential homes in which the Hamas fighters had barricaded themselves and kill the fighters, kill the soldiers, kill the civilians in the process. According to a list of victims compiled by the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, I always forget how to pronounce it. The numbers they have are 792 Israeli civilians, 59 police, and 368 soldiers were killed during the fighting on October 7th and subsequent days. Now, to determine how many were killed by Israel and Hamas, that's going to take a really, detailed investigation, and there are a lot of obstacles to that. So it's going to be hard for us to have, official numbers, and we can get into some of that if that comes up later. I'm trying to come to a close here. There was other things about the what happened October 7th, claims about a lot of mass rapes and beheading babies. All of this has been largely debunked. And there's a lot of evidence for this, which I can bring up if these are things that Jack wants to talk about or disagree with. But the numbers and the data just don't support a lot of a lot of those claims. And again, this is what happens a lot of times when there's major outbreaks of war and violence. There's a little haze, a little bit of wartime propaganda, sensationalism, and we need to cut through that. It's still bad enough that over 1,000 people died, and Hamas is certainly responsible for a lot of them. But we do need to make sure that we're reacting to and looking at what the truth is. But what of the Israeli response? Since October 7th, most estimates are reaching close to 30,000 killed, mostly civilians, and over 12,000 of those being children. U.S. officials such as Barbara Leaf have even suggested that the numbers are likely higher than what's being reported. I know some want to obfuscate these numbers. I don't think that's an argument that can be taken seriously to say that these are coming from Hamas. I mean, the Palestinian Health Ministry, it's not accurate to describe them as Hamas or entirely Hamas controlled. Hamas is sort of like the governing, entity in the Gaza Strip to some extent. But again, it's a little bit more sophisticated than that. The Palestinian Health Ministry also tracks reports all the births and stuff, and reports these birth certificates to the Israeli government and stuff. Historically, independent groups who have gone back throughout the years to do third-party reporting have never found wild discrepancies with what's being reported by the Palestinian Health Ministry. So even if the numbers were off by a certain amount, to pretend it's off by enough to change the narrative, I just think is not a serious argument. Listen, we as libertarians believe in peace and justice. Israel's government, I think it's clear, is not in pursuit of either, and they are responsible for a disproportionate amount of the violence and for propping up circumstances, borders, and leaders in Israel and Gaza which have violated people's rights. And worse, the Israeli civilians are innocent, but their government, and especially the Likud and the extreme Zionists, are clearly not. So then, last point here, why are we quote unquote focusing disproportionately on Israel, or is that even accurate? I would say that many on my side are not disproportionately attacking Israel, but it depends on what you define as proportionate. Do all conflicts deserve equal time? I've done many podcasts on foreign events. I've spent time talking about Ukraine and Russia and China, not just Israel. I think that's true for the entire movement. Dave Smith literally became a meme for years because every time he was on his show or the Joe Rogan Experience or anything, all he would talk about is Yemen, right? So, I mean, it's not like all we ever do is talk about Israel. I will grant that Israel gets a lot of attention, but I think this is warranted. Israel's role in affecting American policy is hard to overstate. It's pretty clear that many U.S. interventions, such as Iraq War II, were committed in part because of Israeli influence. Israel has received historically a disproportionate amount of U.S. foreign aid. Israel and Zionism are sacred cows of the media and establishment. With that said, while attention is given to other governments and abuses and mass murders around the world, there's plenty of good reason to give Israel a little extra pushback and scrutiny. I don't want to be hyperbolic. I'm not here to attack Jack or make any characterizations about him. But I do think that the mass murder of Palestinians in Gaza is one of the most, if not the most worst things going on in the world today. It's one of the most egregious violations of human rights, property rights, and human life. And it's being perpetrated by multiple states who are now combined are the most violent governments that exist today and have been that way for a while. In many ways, Israel is an extension of American imperialism and domination around the globe. And so, I think we're libertarians here. I think everything I said is in the context of libertarian ethics and philosophy, that states violate property rights, states violate self-ownership, the non-aggression principle. These things lead to blowback, and we need to deal with them.
All right. Thank you, Jacob. That was, you didn't quite stay within the time. I hope the war in Israel lasts a little shorter than the amount of time you went over. So, Jack, you're going to get a little bit of extra effort here, or get a little extra attention. But man, sorry, I can't help but joke about that with you, Jacob. In any case, yeah. Well, what I want to do is something that not a lot of moderators do, which is I want to make sure that each of you heard each other correctly, and it's the Steelman. And Jacob, you kind of did that a little bit with Jackson. I know you guys have been engaging on social media. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give Jack an opportunity to sort of summarize what he heard Jacob say. Jacob, you just give an affirmative. Yeah, Jack, you understand you understand it, or you can offer a form of clarification.
So you just want me to summarize his point, because he made a lot of points.
Well, no, he did. I would say if you could summarize his argument to make sure we know what he's saying, rather than just
argument. It's just that Israel is worthy of critique, and he finds it egregious enough that it should be worthy of a focus. That's the main thing, because he didn't make any specific policy recommendations. There was no particular outcome that he stated.
Okay.
There's a lot, and I do actually have a lot to say about that in kind, about the history and the framing.
Sure.
That's okay.
Okay. Why, if I were to ask, why do you think he focuses so much heavily on some of the more recent data, the blowback situation, et cetera, and why it's unique? Like, what drives that in your mind?
Drives his focus?
Yeah, on that as a libertarian.
Oh, I can't speak for what's inside his head. The only thing that's outside circumstantial is just that it's whatever's in the media, in the news cycle, right? Okay. If it's bleeds, it leads. So if you're seeing the mainstream news, all these other war reporters follow whatever's there. I mean, they're commenting based on that. It's not weird. Just like Ukraine was 5 minutes ago, 500,000 dead in the official sources, and that's last month's statistic. I mean, that's pretty much it. But I'd love to address the specifics of Israel and some framings too.
Yeah. Okay. Jacob, how do you feel about the overall summary?
Yeah, I mean, I guess Jack's a little disappointed I didn't give a specific policy prescription. I mean, I think we're here to talk about what the response is, which I guess, we could offer a solution, but I mean, that's complicated, right? I mean, the solution I think we would agree on, which the solution is people should stop violating the non-aggression principle and stop violating people's rights. States should be abolished, right? We're all ANCAPs here. So, how do we get there? I mean, that's a conversation we could have, but I think part of being able to even have that conversation is understanding how we got here. And if we don't understand and agree how we got here, we won't get much past that. But I do think his summary in terms of like that, yes, I think that there's a lot of things that have happened, and Israel is worthy of critique. And so he was correct in stating that is my position. So yeah.
Okay. How would you summarize Jack's position?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jack sees. If I were to summarize a lot of where Jack is coming from what he said, I think he sees so much of what is good in Israel in terms of like the people, right? The culture, the society, being connected to, Jewish roots and ancestry and culture. Listen, I find value in that too, as a descendant of the tribe, as it were. I grew up with my bubby, it was Yiddish for grandmother. So my bubby lived with us. She spent many years in Israel and would come back, and she would do Hanukkah with us. I remember doing the feasts and whatnot. My dad, was a he didn't call himself a Messianic Jew, but he was a converted Jew and still, observed a lot of his Jewish roots, and was a pastor of sorts who always spoke about, Christian things in a way that would like connect them to their Jewish roots and whatnot. And so, I very much think that Jack sees a lot of the positives there, and I think, although he acknowledges that the government there is like any government and does bad things, he thinks that people might be focusing so much on their criticisms of Israel that they're making Israel entirely, not just the state, out to be this boogeyman, conflating all the Jewish people with maybe the worst parts of Zionism, or people are mischaracterizing Zionism, and that people are, and I think that there are parts of what he said where that people are misunderstanding the history, that they think it's just kind of like, colonialism. And he did acknowledge that, some bad things happened, but it's not unique to any other, country. And so, why would people be talking so much about that when they don't have the same sort of outrage about other situations? So I think that's a summary of what he said.
Yeah, Jack, did that sort of comport with what you think you were saying? Did Jacob do it right?
Yeah. Generally, that's some of them. I do have a bit more because there is something very specific that I want to get to. That's actually at the root.
Well, I think we owe you a few more minutes on the timer, so I'll give you the floor a little bit to start that. What's that?
I said at least 15 by my count.
Yeah. Well, I have it at 11 over is what he went, but if I'm counting, so yeah.
All right. So I want to get knee deep here because I want to demystify some of these myths about the history. And we're going to actually dive in on some of these things that are often promoted in the mainstream by Scott Horton and the like, LCI and others. And some of it you actually even brought up, but you skimmed over it in such a way that I don't think people picked up on it. But we're going to take a look right back to 1949, right? So when people talk about what's going on in Gaza and the horrific things there, right? The geography of Gaza used to actually be controlled by Egypt back, when it was named differently, under the Arab Republic, right? So they actually had military rule over there in 49 and really picked up in 59 to 67. And during that military rule, they actually had the restrictions on the Palestinian people there. And it was so strong with their curfews that actually is what led to 500,000 of them going on welfare dependency. So when you think about the incentives in economics and people are talking about Israel, people ignored the other things that are going on around in this situation because it was actually Egypt that put these people into a permanent welfare dependency through the UNRWA, which is a permanent refugee aid organization that nobody else in the world has. Nobody else in the world has permanent refugee status forever. It's like once you're settled, that's it. You're no longer a refugee. They were given permanent status. And that welfarism, those entrenched incentives actually came from Egypt ruling, not from Israel technically, actually from Egypt. And people don't know this history. And so when that kept on going, you had a permanent dependent class. And today, 30,000 people are employed by this organization. And it's not surprising. Anybody in any other welfare, conceptualization of any other state and be like, oh, yeah, you're creating a dependent class on this government welfare would be like, oh, okay, that's obvious, right? You create a class of dependents and they're going to become dependent on aid forever, right? Because, oh, okay, they're going to shut them off from everything. So when people are talking about, these situations, these areas, they definitely ignore the rest of what's going on, right? So as you can see here, the Rafah border is controlled by Egypt. Israel, of course, manages the other side. But when people are talking about being imprisoned in this situation, they're missing that it's actually just borders. And that's uncomfortable for people who are thinking about this, because if they realize that, oh my gosh, wait, this is just strong borders, checkpoints, people can't go and freely move about and trade, right? Then suddenly that's going to come back against people who are really into borders. The open air prison is actually a distraction from that. And even though Israel does terrible things where they send a military, they might shoot people, they've had curfews depending on the time, and most certainly have been brutal. So I don't deny that. But when people talk about open air prison, they ignore the fact that there's actually tunnels that went all underneath there with the whole human shield top surface population. And people would actually get supplies and guns and stuff like that from these underground tunnels. And Egypt cracked down a little bit in 2013, but they still get it through, obviously. Hamas managed to get quite a few rockets and machine guns to kill over 1,000 people. So when we're talking about these situations, language can obfuscate reality. Sure, it's brutal inside there for some people, but is it really about being a prison, or is it really actually strong borders because they're not citizens? And so, like citizens of other countries, you can't just freely cross a border. So that obfuscation of language is a really important food for thought process when it comes to this. Now, with that strong border that people don't really think about, a lot of people say Israel created Hamas, right? So when it comes to this concept, I like to actually read the accounts of someone who actually was a part of Hamas. This is Masab Hassan Youssef, who is one of the 7 co-founders of Hamas. He's the son of one of the 7 co-founders of Hamas. He actually lived through it and eventually became a Christian. And we're on the Libertarian Christian Institute. So I think it's very important to bring in a Christian who rejected his upbringing, and he actually talked about the brutality of what went down in the area and was able to speak to it in such a special way. He was able to encapsulate that the psychology of the people through Hamas was about radical Islam and about a death culture. And he doesn't glamorize the IDF either. He admits the IDF can be brutal. They have brutal prisons for torture when they're trying to find out who's a terrorist agent. But he himself came to this conclusion that fundamentally, this is a battle of ideas. And the battle of ideas here is that, unfortunately, for people in Gaza, there is a political leadership that does not care about them. And so when you see the stories of kids being killed and stuff like that, they're being pushed out intentionally in front of these soldiers, being told to throw rocks and being told to do, whatever it is to try to get a reaction, because they don't care if their kids die. They don't. They're trained to say, hey, if you die for Allah, you're going to go to heaven and you will be, greatly rewarded. That is a psychological backdrop that exists. And that's not something that is, just made up. This is a deep history. This Islamic jihad. Again, it's not every single Muslim wants to do this outright, but it is certainly a part of that fundamentalist radical Islam. And if you miss that part of the equation, then you miss this whole battle with the Zionism and the fundamentalist Islamic mentality. And if you miss that, then you're not really getting to any solutions anyway, because you have to be able to see that people need to exit that. They need to love their neighbor as themselves. They need to say, hey, it's not right to go and sacrifice your sons and go have them blow themselves up on a bus and to, tit for tat, kill people and mass murder people. And the blowback language, while certainly relevant for a political context, misses the core psychology of a death cult that continues to foster this blowback and tit for tat stuff with Israel. And again, Israel has their part too in it. But this idea that, it's just their fault, that Israel just constructed them all, is total nonsense. It's hilarious. He debunks that himself in here too. And again, he lived it, and he eventually fled to the U.S., became a Christian. So this narrative is bunk. And in fact, not only is it bunk, but one of the people that people refer to when they're talking about this is Avner Cohen. And he was a former Israeli security agent. And in 2009, in the Wall Street Journal, he did this op-ed thing where he talked about specifically what it was that the Israeli government was doing. So when you're saying, Israel supported Hamas with that, what do they mean by that? Do they mean Israel was like, here's a bunch of rockets and a bunch of machine guns, go and kill some Jewish kids today? No, this is the crazy part. It meant that they just said, we'll let you build mosques and schools and Islamic University. And if you want to set up a charity, fine, right? They let in money for Qatar and Iran. So in other words, the Israeli government was just like, here's some money coming in. It's going to go to Hamas. Should we take it by force? No, we'll let it in. Okay. Here's some people saying they want to come study Islamic University. They could be training for terrorism. Okay, well, just let them in. So you have this kind of funny thing, right? Where on one hand, this is an open air prison. But wait, it's because the Israeli government's controlling them. But wait, they allowed them to build schools and they allowed them to build training centers. And, but you're supporting Hamas by allowing them to do the things that you say, if they can't do that, now it's a prison. The hypocrisy is kind of crazy when you think about the mental gymnastics, right? On one hand, Israel's controlling them, but then they just are like, well, we'll let you just build your organization, your religious organization. We'll let you get money from other countries, whatever. So they're missing this whole context that the support for the radicals existed outside. It came out of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it came in response to people being just kind of frustrated with people's rejection of Islam. It's almost like a revivalist movement or temperance movement kind of thing that happened over there. So this fervency about the situation, is something that has to be taken into account, right? Statism is a problem on both sides. And I want to actually mention something that he said in his in a speech recently that is Mossab Hassan Youssef said. I just found it very powerful. He said, "What do the Palestinian people need? They don't need a Hamas, a terrorist organization of savages that ignite a war in order for them to cultivate wealth, power, and territory, etc. They don't care for the people. What do people need? They don't even need a state. What do we need? We need to build a nation. And I've said this many times, Hamas is fighting for a statehood. Palestinian Authority was fighting for statehood. Yasser Arafat was fighting for a state. Everybody fighting for a state, but no one's investing any effort to build a nation. You know why? Because building a nation requires selfless leadership, a model like Gandhi that would drop all the personal gain in order to build a nation. I am not a sheep and I am not a shepherd. I'm just an individual enough unto my own. Those who want the state because the state comes with power. With a nation comes lots of work and responsibility. They don't want that. They want the fruit, but they don't want the effort. I don't want to even think about a Palestinian state. I don't care for a Palestinian state. We have 22 Arab states, and all of them are garbage. So this man who did not become Jewish, he became Christian. He eventually left and did some operations with IDF, basically secretly reporting and looking and seeing what Hamas was doing, came to his own conclusions. And he saw for himself that there was a death cult culture within the area and that people were all too willing to murder themselves and murder other innocents, creating a perpetual cycle of blowback. And so why I want to bring that together here is because we're here on the Libertarian Christian Institute. If I'm not bringing it back to some of those issues, what are we doing, right? So he is saying that the psychology of not having a Christ-like attitude that underpinned Islam there has been a major part of this. It's not just simply, oh, well, they're just sad about their kids dying, this, that. They're putting their kids out there and saying, shoot our kids. We don't care. We want a state. And even when you mentioned, like, for example, Yasser Arafat and the 2000 Accords, right? This is what's left out of that commentary. The offer was that there would be a demilitarized Palestinian state on some 92% of the West Bank, 100% of the Gaza Strip. And then there would be a dismantling of the settlements and the concentration of the bulk of the settlers inside the 8% of the West Bank to be annexed by Israel. So there is this move to actually create a Palestinian state and to give East Jerusalem, the capital, as a Palestinian state. What did Arafat say? No. He said, I'm not going to do any of this. He wanted power. He wanted to rule, and he wanted Israel wiped off the map. He wanted the Jews gone and dead. And so people who downplay these things are deceiving others about the nature of these things. They have this whole psychology that moral agency can never be grounded in people who are suffering any type of conflict or this or that, right? There's this sudden idea that, well, if they were, historically harmed, then they're justified in sending their kids to go be blown up to bits. That's not a libertarian psychology. A libertarian psychology says, no, you shouldn't go and have your children murdered. You shouldn't go and have them and encourage them to go blow themselves up in a school bus or in front of a movie theater and to kill innocent people. So you can't sit there and have this two-way psychology. You have to be able to critique both. And if you're on the Christian Institute here, that should be obvious. Jews and Muslims need the message of the gospel and to think outside of violence, because turning the other cheek here would do a whole lot of good for people having peace. And if you care about children not dying, that is most certainly the ethic you want to be promoting, not just simply, pushing down, whatever, de-escalating with things with the state, but saying, okay, what are the cultural things that are going on? What is at the root? And if you do not deal with that and you do not recognize that is also a problem, then you're missing the total picture. And that total picture is definitely missed time and again. For example, I would think another quick one was the Suez crisis and with Egypt controlling the waterways, right? People will say, oh, well, if Egypt nationalizes the waterway or stops transport and causes a blockade, well, Israel deserves it, right? That's another one of these misframings. If you say, oh, well, other people, a blockade or embargoes, that's an act of war. But if you do it to Jews, If you have, like, for example, Deir Yassin, right? Jews, 100,000 of them in Jerusalem were being starved to death by Arabs who were blocking it. They literally created a blockade, starving to death 100,000 people. Nobody cares about that. They don't care about that history. They're just like, oh, okay, dear, you've seen they try to capture that to stop the blockade. They're trying to stop people who had arms and who were, shooting Jewish convoys and food coming in. So I'm here to bring in some of that bigger picture thinking and some of these other framings, because again, you get people who skirt by it without thinking much about it, right? They'll say, well, you can't trust the CIA, you can't trust Israel, except when the CIA and Israel agrees with what I believe, right? And then we just heard that. Hey, appeal to authority about, or appeal to just the generalization of personal incredulity, right? Oh, the CIA, how could they be lying about this? Israeli government, how could they be lying? Oh, well, because it fits your narrative, so then they're telling the truth. And it's just something to catch, right? Because the people that often others are relying on, they haven't been to Israel. They haven't been to any of these places. They're doing on-the-ground reporting. So that's why I prefer to look at direct sources, people who lived it. And I highly recommend picking up Son of Hamas to get a start to thinking about this, because you want to have something of someone who actually grew up there, lived it, and has seen both sides, both the Hamas side and the Israel side. So definitely expand your thinking and don't lose sight of the fact that this is a battle of ideas. At the end of the day, it's a battle of ideas, and we need to change minds for liberty and for peace.
All right. Thank you, guys. This has been enlightening. I feel like I've been through a whirlwind of data and statistics, and Jack, I really appreciate. We're gonna kind of switch to a bit of conversation and Q&A. I'm gonna ask a few questions, and then we can also you guys can sort of ask each questions of each other and rebut against each other for a little bit here. And for those who are watching live, you're welcome to send in some questions for either of us, or for either either Jacob or Jack there. And let me just frame out a few things. So I want to bring this back, like what you did, Jack, with the fact that we are the Libertarian Christian Institute, and we have a great interest in the Jewish people for a handful of reasons, not least of which is the heritage of the two of you, as well as the Christian piece, the relationship piece. We as Americans, just the foreign policy connection with Israel is also an important thing. Whether we want to identify primarily as Americans or not, it's kind of not beside the point. But the libertarian or the Christian viewpoint, and I want to ask this to both of you. The Christian viewpoint is that we need to de-escalate violence, and I'm hearing Jacob say Israel is probably probably can live up to this faster in a way, and should put down its arms and not do what it's doing. That would be, in my way, hearing Jacob saying, well, Israel can be the first one to say, no, we're not going to escalate the violence. In fact, and can even admit that it possibly did. I mean, the state of Israel, the people who are in charge of it, they may not want to be able to see this, even though we can, that they've done things that were antagonistic to those around them, right? The create blowback situation. So my impression of what you're saying, Jacob, is that Israel should be the one to do that. On the libertarian side, we're also against non-aggression. And so, Jack, what I'm hearing you say is we all have agency. Hamas has agency. Individuals who live in Gaza, individuals who live in Israel have agency to stop violence as well. And if I'm hearing you correctly, everyone's asking Jews to put down their guns, but no one's asking anybody else to. Or it seems like that's what is the narrative. And you're nodding. It sounds like I got it right. Jacob, did I analyze yours right?
I mean, it's close enough. I mean, I could nitpick it.
Well, we're libertarians. we can nitpick everything, right? Well, what I guess well, actually, more so than just we're all three libertarians here. The two of you are like open anarchists in the sense of like you believe that a stateless society is a better outcome. And so in some ways, the problem is really with the state of Israel, as opposed to just the Jews in the Middle East.
And to be clear, I tried to, and it's tough when you're reading stuff and writing, I tried to, as much as I could, say state of Israel as much as I can and distinguish that from the Israeli people, because it is an important distinction, because the people are innocent.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, by and large, in a sense, I mean, obviously there is complicity and you deal with all those moral conundrums, but there's that.
I'm not Bin Laden. I don't hold people accountable for the actions of their government.
Okay, so I guess what I want to sort of ask both of you is what is, and I'll start with you, Jacob, because Jack brought it up, and I do kind of get the point of like, well, no, we kind of have to say, well, what should actually happen? Does this really mean that Israel just literally just puts down its guns and stops and just, puts up a strong border to keep Hamas from literally, coming into their borders? Like, what is actually, what do you want Israel to do other than to stop some of the atrocities that are sometimes questionable? I'm sorry, with the reports of which are questionable.
I think the answer is to give the Palestinian people their rights and their liberty, and deal with the terrorists like people would deal with the terrorists here. Here in America, if we have domestic terrorists, for the most part, what you do is you go and you have special op forces, and you go and you take out the people committing the violence. You don't carpet bomb entire city blocks and buildings and things like that. And so, I mean, the issue is, I think, that this is one of the worst places to live in the world. It's incredibly densely populated. I mean, I'm not sure when Jack was kind of giving his rebuttal, to what I said in terms of describing it as a prison. I'm not sure that there's a huge distinction between kind of being imprisoned or being the victim of two nations on either side of you enforcing very strong borders. It kind of seems to be a distinction without a difference. I mean, yes, there is it's not a literal prison. They're able to get weapons and stuff and stuff that's not that much different than actual prisons. That happens a lot. The point is never that Gaza was literally identical to a U.S. prison. The point is that they are surrounded, on every inch of their border, and that they are occupied, and controlled. Their area is controlled by both the Israeli government and by Hamas. And this is after a long occupation from basically 67 to 05. I'm saying, as Christians, we're told to love our enemy. I'm going to put myself in the shoes of the Palestinians, especially the ones who were born into those circumstances, and say, who wouldn't be easily radicalized into like a more like Islamic fundamentalist mindset, or even just without that, who just wouldn't be incentivized to violently resist those conditions? And not that it's right, but we have to understand the power dynamics at play. I don't think that's against libertarian ethics or principles to say that we have this tiny strip of land that's kind of run by a terrorist group that the state of Israel allowed to run free in there, and they've been held there by the state for a long time. I agree with what Jack's saying in terms of like, well, these people are caught in like a harmful ideology to a certain extent, and we should like pray and hope for those people to break free of that. But we have to recognize the incentives on the ground because of the circumstances that they're raised in. Even, I understand the argument that like people have agency, but I mean, I just think we have to be honest with, imagining how horrific it must be to not only live there, but imagine again, being born there. There are people who have never stepped outside of Gaza. And so that's what I would say is that, yeah, and as far as the solution, end it. Like, I mean, I think a two-state solution is just not possible at this point. I think the better thing is to say, you know what, like, the Jewish supermajority isn't more important than people's rights. And so the people living in the West Bank and the people living in Gaza, they need to stop, being forced to live under the occupation of like, you're not sovereign to govern yourselves completely, and also you're not going to have equal rights, and you're trapped there. That needs to end. And then people who continue to initiate violence against the Israeli people, go after them in a way that is in keeping with the libertarian understanding of self-defense, proportionality, things like that.
Yeah. Jack, I could give you obviously a chance to answer my question to both of you, which is, what kind of sort of practical solutions do you have? And you're also welcome to respond to some of the solutions and comments that Jacob has here.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So the thing that I like to think, and focus on, of course, is always this philosophy. I love thinking about, okay, what is the comparative situation compared to what? Do you apply this consistently? And one of the difficulties that people have to come to terms with is that, well, more people, that is more Jews, were kicked out of Arab countries and pogromed out and persecuted, including a place like Iraq, where they were told you can take, 3 shirts with you, 3 pants, 50 dinar, you have to get rid of all your stuff, and then you can finally leave. There was more Jews kicked out of the Arab world than there were in the Nakba of people who were fleeing mostly because of fear, because they were told lies about Jews like raping and killing, pregnant women and stuff like that. So we have this situation where on one hand, people will say, well, maybe there'd be a 2-state solution, or maybe Israel should adopt them. So then I go, okay, well, does that mean Israel needs or all the Jews who are in Israel who are refugees and their descendants, do they get to have restitution in all these countries? Do they get to have repatriation? And do they have a right of self-determination? Does this mean that we get 9 satellite Jewish states now? Most of them are going to say, not only is that ridiculous in terms of practicality, but obviously not, right? Jews have been pogromed out of everywhere, and Israel has been the recipient and the protector effectively, comparatively. Of course, the Israeli government's actually hurting them in many ways because it's the government, but comparatively, for quite a long time, right? So literally all these Jews are not welcome really back in those places. In fact, the last 2 Jews were just not too long ago evacuated out of Afghanistan because the Taliban took over. So we have this situation where people want to play this game of, we're going to fix all these historical norms of people who were kicked out and this or that, but they don't really apply it equally. They're not really looking to reset the 20th century. So what I like to focus on, as usual, is just what is a way that maybe there could be something that you have civil protections, civil rights protections, but without getting into all the extra problems and the new struggles of democracy, right? Because that's what everybody's scared of. They're scared that if there's a Palestinian state, well, they're going to support Hamas. And oh, great, you're going to have a government whose chief aims is to pillage and suicide bomb, right? Not exactly a welcoming idea. Then there's the Jews who are like, if they come in, then they're going to vote for Jews to be destroyed, right? Just like people in America are like, oh my gosh, I can't believe these immigrants are coming across the border. What are they going to vote for, right? Woo. But then all of a sudden over there, they're like, well, we'll ignore that and their concerns because they, deserve to have them be in a new democracy where they get overturned, right? It's just kind of playing more status games. I want to exit out of that. I don't think democracy is the solution. I don't think statism is the solution. I do think that there are ways to deal with these things. And again, I'm just talking the internet. I'm not pretending I have any power over these things. Just food for fun. This is academic. There's ways to do things where you can have restitution, right? People who actually were forcibly kicked out of their homes, right? And that kind of thing. They could be restituted. People could have their homes given back who had settlements or eminent domain, just like in America. I mean, America has, it's funny that in Israel, they're like, oh my gosh, these settlers are taking homes. And I'm like, yeah, they call that eminent domain in America, where the government, like, for example, in Florida, kicked out 12,000 black residents of Overton to build I-95, right? But nobody cares, right? They're like, oh, okay, black people were all forced out. 12,000, who cares? That's old news. Middle 20th century. Who cares about those people, right? So there's so many different atrocities around the world that people can't even just keep up with. So it's just a good reminder to get back and be grounded in reality of, what's going on. What do you actually have power over? What are we really trying to convince people of? So, there is that other possibility that when it comes to, restitution things and stuff like that, they could do something where they, if they were willing to, which again, doubtful, but they would just have Egypt have the control of the area, or Syria. And then you have a half coverage thing with East Jerusalem, that kind of thing, things they talked about before doing, when it comes to possible ways to carve it up, and then they become citizens there. Personally, I think it makes a little bit of sense considering Egypt already ruled over Gaza. That was already a thing. And they lost the war a couple times. So the losers typically in history pay the restitution, not that makes anything, right or anything like that. It's just the reality of that. In every other case, the losers had to deal with the refugees and that, and they were settled, and then game over, right? And then you had some aid agencies that would give people money and help them resettle, whatever. So, there's a lot of different ways that it could be dealt with theoretically, but none of these deal with the root issue. They don't deal with the heart changes, and they don't deal with the mind changes. And until those things are fixed, you still have a bunch of people who are going to say, it doesn't matter what Israel and the government does. It doesn't matter if there's restitution. We're going to send in people to go blow people up and keep it going, and other groups are going to fund them. Iran and Hezbollah and other stuff like that. it is very difficult to fix that type of problem. And it cannot be fixed if the mentality is Israel and Jews don't have a right to exist there at all, right? So you can't even have that. You can't even have that if that's the mentality. And again, I'm not saying that's all different people's views there. There's, of course, a diversity of backgrounds and, ethnicities and religions and people who are in Gaza, West Bank, that kind of thing. But you have to be realistic about what is most likely when you're talking about, moving forward, if you were to give citizenship and this or that. So, in America, there's, nationals, U.S. nationals, right? They don't vote, but they have civil rights protections. We know people in Washington, D.C., they can't vote for senators, but they have civil rights protections. So, Israel could do something like that too, moving toward a libertarian order, actually having civil rights protections, moving toward them having, their own policing and stuff like that. There's lots of different things, but until, that heart change happens, it's very difficult to move, forward on those things. But no matter what, of course, we should advocate Israel becomes a libertarian order, like everything else: privatized, restitution, property rights, free trade, inroads to peace.
Jacob, I saw you were viscerally groaning at a couple points, and in fact, it happens to be that it was one of the points that I was like, well, wait, Jack, the whole eminent domain thing, that is a libertarian critique, and you groaned, Jacob, I think on it. So like for many Americans, it does seem like you're right, Jack. There's a lot of like, oh, well, we can let us just what the government does, but with Israel, it's a really bad thing.
Well, hold on, but no one, when the black people in Florida had their properties taken, they weren't then deported into a small, geographic landscape and told to stay there for 50 plus years. Eminent domain's bad, but like, I just don't think it's a good comparison. Well, yeah, and the Native Americans were treated very badly by the American government.
They were put on reservations where they had military occupation, by the way. That's a Cherokee. Trail of Tears, military occupation. They couldn't leave the reservation. So that's what you're describing.
Yeah, no one from a libertarian position is defending those things. But at least right now,
they want to fix the home stuff, though. They don't care about fixing what's at home. They want to fix something 6,000 miles away they don't control, but there's people suffering.
Hold on. Native Americans, by and large, in America have equal rights and the ability to travel and to do things and to work and to
they're not constrained
have pursuit of
happiness.
Yeah, they're not stuck. There's not a military on either side keeping them, stuck. I mean, like, look at the Walk of Return. Like, Native Americans aren't dealing with stuff like that, Jack. I just don't think that these comparisons hold at all.
You'd have to talk about other people who are suffering. That's right. You'd have to talk about other people who are suffering, because when that was happening, it was suffering. People dying on the trails. You're like, well, it's old, so they're not suffering anymore. They're still displaced.
No, Jack, we can chew bubblegum and walk at the same time. Yeah. Like, we can't every time we talk about Israel just say, but what about all the other bad things that have ever happened and that are happening right now? Okay, Jack, we do talk about those things. Literally, my last podcast episode is talking about Ukraine and Russia and actually bringing up the fact that because of Israel, people have kind of put that in the back burner of their minds, and that's not right. But you act like none of us are doing that, and all we're talking about is Israel. I don't think that's true.
I'm not arguing that toward you, by the way. That's not my position.
Okay, that's fine. But and maybe you don't think about me, but I don't think that any of us are doing that. But I do think that we're giving Israel its due attention because of the disproportionate amount of money it receives and the disproportionate amount of influence I think it has over American politics and foreign policy. So I don't think that these things are... Now, listen, I want to agree with one of the things you said, and I think you also agreed with one of the things that I said. But I'm trying to understand how then we're not on the same page. I agree with you that even if we change what the states in these regions are doing, that's not going to change the culture or the hearts of the people right away. And that is sort of like the more long-term fundamental issue. Like, long-term, we want to see culture improve and hearts change, here at the LCI, we want more than that, as you alluded to. We want to see the gospel preached to them. But, it's a little hard to see that cultural change happen, to see hearts be changed, to even go and preach the gospel to people who are living under such violence and oppression. So we can't
preaching if there are no streets.
Right. So, I mean, I just think we have to acknowledge that reality on the ground. Now, you said you disagreed with something I said in terms of like what the solutions are, but then you sort of ended on saying what I said, which is that they should have protected civil rights and equal rights. voting isn't a right. I never said they had to be given the right to vote. That's not. I mean, listen, we're anarchists here, right? Democracy is a spook to use crap, I forget his name. You know what I'm talking about. Stirner, to use a Stirner reference. It's a spook, right? We don't believe in democracy. So I don't care if they can vote, but they should at least not be landlocked and have their civil liberties denied. And last thing, you compared this to immigration. Well, listen, you and I are actually both more in agreement on the immigration issue. Like, I'm traditionally more on the, listen, we're anarchists. So again, private borders, private property rights, that's the goal. I think that having the state control borders and then restrict travel to a large degree does cause a lot of problems. But then it's like you were sort of saying, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong from what you're saying, but you were almost like, well, what are we supposed to do? Let these people travel here when they can do violence. So I'm like, well, are you saying America needs open borders, but Israel needs controlled borders? Like, I'm not sure what you're trying to get at there, because it seems like the point you brought up about immigration would apply to my side of the argument, to be like, well, no, like if we're going to say America shouldn't, even with people panicking about this mass infusion of people here, which, listen, there's going to, even though I will usually end up on like the more open side of the equation when it comes to the borders, I think you and I would agree there's still consequences to that. And I'm not saying there wouldn't be consequences to giving the Palestinians the rights, but can't we agree that until that happens, we're not going to make progress on any of the other stuff? We can't collectively punish a group of people because of what some of them might do.
What do you think,
yeah. Well, the thing is that's exactly my point. I'm bringing up these hypocrisies to showcase the hypocrisies. I'm not saying that I hold the hypocrisies. I'm showing common cultural tropes, not necessarily you, of course, because I need to be able to address the broader, world.
Okay, that's fine. I'm just trying to. I'm trying to contextualize. I don't want to ascribe
something to you that you don't hold. Of course not. No, I mean, with what I wrote in my book, A Vision for a Libertarian Future, I actually discuss these types of incrementalisms where we're moving away from state control. And those things apply as well to what I'm talking about with Israel and the United States. It doesn't matter where you are. These principles can apply. And those principles are talking specifically about moving toward privatization with concrete, not, net taxpayer battle nonsense, not people fighting in democracy, actually having real privatization, actually having real restitution, actually freeing the market and having private defense and things like that. So that's actually what I'm for Israel. Some people have different ideas of like, no, the first thing is a two-state solution, or, oh, Israel needs to have them all come in, they vote, or, oh, Israel just needs to be erased off the map.
Well, and to be clear, obviously, I don't think Israel should be erased off the map in terms of an incremental approach. I think that's wrong. I think most of us have been on that side. I don't know anyone from the Libertarian Institute or antiwar.com or Dave Smith who's saying Israel needs to be wiped off the face of the map. None of us have said that. Now, listen, I don't care if the Palestinians get voting rights. However, I would not, if what had to happen in some kind of deal was that they had to be given voting rights, like if that's something they're like, working out and they're not budging on, I don't think that it's fair to be like, you know what? No, we're going to resort back to the status quo because you guys want to vote and we're not going to let you. I think in terms of incrementalism and moving towards a more libertarian order, it would still be a step in the right direction to stop militarily occupying these people, surrounding them, bombing them, death toll in the tens of thousands. If the next step from that is equal rights, but we're increasing democracy temporarily and they're allowed to vote, I don't think that is something that we should be dying on the hill of, or that Israel should be dying on the hill of. I understand from the Jewish perspective, listen, the Jews were pogromed and persecuted, and Zionism was largely a response from that. But here's another Christian principle. And just the universal principle we have to understand as people, as libertarians: hurt people. And that's true on an individual level, on a psychological level. It's also true on a societal level and a political level. And I think what has unfortunately happened, and it grieves me to say this as someone who is Jewish, but I think that a lot of what has happened historically is that Zionism became a largely, in many ways, predatory force in response to, like, they were getting tired of being preyed upon. You look at like Zebatinsky and other, like, historic Jewish leaders and stuff, that they were fighters, man. Like, they were warriors. They were like, you know what, enough's enough. We're not going to be persecuted anymore. We're going to have a homeland no matter what it takes. Now, listen, I can understand how they got there, but it's not compatible with libertarianism to be like, you know what, like, we were hurt, we've been persecuted, so now we're going to displace another group of people as a response to that. And listen, the Holocaust, one of the worst things that has ever happened in history. I remember going to the Holocaust Museum as a teenager and crying, going through the exhibits, crying, looking at the wall with like the list of names and stuff. And Schindler's List is one of my favorite movies. It's not like a fun movie to watch, but it's just a powerful movie to watch to see how people survived in such terrible circumstances. I believe so strongly in the sentiment of never again. But honestly, Jack, I just can't help but feel, as a Jewish person, that what has happened historically and even what is continuing to happen now is that the Israeli state, in the name of never again, is doing it again, is persecuting a people. And maybe genocide is like not quite the right word there, but it's too close for comfort. It's we're talking, listen, 1,000 people tragically died October 7th, and Hamas, every single person responsible for that attack, should be punished, should be killed, or locked up forever, right? But okay, like, again, and that's what I said earlier, I can condemn Hamas all day long. Can we at least agree that we also have to condemn the IDF? Because this has gone way beyond a proportional response. And so I'm just, that's something that we can agree on, I'm wondering.
Oh yeah, well yeah. The funny thing is we always already agree on that because
okay,
I'm anti-state. You have to understand, I'm always anti-state, so I'm against the escalations by the Israeli government, the IDF. That's the whole part of the tit for tat thing, right? Because it's a constant state of escalation, but the ideology that underpins what is the most jarring aspects of it, in a lot of ways, is the willingness of those in Hamas to sacrifice children and to put them in front of tanks and other stuff like that, to be used as propaganda tools, so that, when they throw rocks or there's something, some explosion goes off, or someone takes credit for, because there's also times that there's faked explosives too on that side as well. So where they blame the Israeli government and it wasn't them, that kind of thing. It goes both ways. It's a propaganda war on so many levels.
Sure, so, I agree.
Mm-hmm.
One more, I have like one little question. I want to pitch it back to Doug here. Can we agree then, like, we agree there's propaganda on both sides? Sure. We agree that Hamas is, to some extent, like, we're saying that they're willing to let children die. Like, let's say I'm going to grant that to you. You agree that that's not a universal problem in Islam, right? Like, there's not Muslims all over the world. There's not Muslims here in the U.S. who are like, screw our children. If they die for a good cause, they're going to heaven. Like, it's not to me, I see this and like, it's not a Muslim problem, and it is an ideology problem, but this radical ideology is the thing that a desperate people who were living in, and again, I do cling to the either concentration camp or open air prison language, people living in this brutal conditions, of course they're going to be attracted to that kind of ideological extremism, because they're desperate.
Yes,
that's part of blowback.
It's a part of, yes, certainly. I completely agree with you. You can create blowback by people being traumatized. However, I'm going to give you two important facts, and it's going to really contextualize it, right? So here's two things that when you think about it, you're like, okay, maybe there's a little more to it. So when it comes to the radicalization elements, right, that is very specific and historical. This, Islam is a conquering religion. It came out of literally spitting at the Byzantine Christians and having the dome built to basically say, "Ha, we've conquered you, Christians." So the history of Islam and the caliphate is a violent conquest, and it's kind of silly to pretend like as if, there isn't something built into there where it's like Jews are pigs and they deserve to die as part of that type of extreme statist intersection. In the same way that you'd be like, wow, if you're a really racist Zionist person, you have really, wicked intentions. right? If you're a statist, racist, Zionist, oh, bad. If you're a statist, fundamentalist Muslim, and the thing is, you only got 16-ish, 17 million Jews, you got 2 billion Muslims. Even if it's a very tiny percentage, well, guess what? That's a lot of people. That's tens of millions if you have 2 billion global Muslims, right? So again, that's why it's a scale issue when you could see that violence come out. Now, the other part that I was going to talk about is Japan, right? Japan had more innocent civilians get mass murdered with 2 atomic bombs, right, than IDF has killed in 75 years. Japan lost the war. U.S. put in a bunch of military bases, occupied them, rewrote their constitution, gave women equal rights by it. American soldiers would rape Japanese women and get away with all kinds of crimes from their bases. Did the Japanese go and shoot rockets at the U.S. soldiers who were stationed in their country while they were banned from guns? Their military was neutered. Did the Japanese keep kamikazing and blowing up the Americans? No.
Should we nuke Gaza? Is that like? I'm being a little tongue in cheek, but like we literally.
I'm talking about the fact that other people did not go and start suicide bombing because of occupation by the U.S. government. They did, with more people murdered, not occupation. They didn't go and start killing them all. The Japanese didn't go and start like, oh, we're going to have a forever war with these, white invaders. What's the ideological difference? When you get that part, that there is a psychology that's different, and that's why the violence continues, then it clicks. And I made this comment too when it came to the Pulse nightclub shooter, right? Scott Horton makes this thing. He's like, oh, he just was doing it out of blowback. I'm like, dude, this guy was born in America in a New York Jewish hospital. He's Afghani. His parents are Afghani. His dad was an FBI agent, which is the most suspicious thing. He was complaining about Syria bombing and other stuff. He had nothing to do with that directly. He went and he shot up a gay nightclub. He didn't go blow up like an army recruiting station or even a police station. He shot a bunch of innocent people. Why is it that you and me, we are like, wow, the U.S. government shouldn't be bombing Syria. This is evil. But we don't go and blow up a bunch of innocent people. What's the difference? The difference is ideology. He believes that it's okay to go and murder people. Why did he believe that? Listen to the full transcript of the call. He said, I am joining ISIS far more times than he said, oh, I'm just sad about kids dying. He said that he was a soldier of Allah and Muhammad. He was, sent by Muhammad, essentially. He said that far more times. That's the psychological difference. You don't go and kill innocent people because you're mad at U.S. policy. You don't go and shoot up some random people because you have a Christian faith and you know that you do not want to hurt innocent people. People who have a different ideology of that radical kind do not. The Japanese got bombed like crazy. They're still way more advanced. They didn't go shoot up a bunch of stuff. They didn't have Islam.
I don't
fundamentalist Islam. That is a core factor. And if you don't see that, then I highly recommend, again, read Son of Hamas. This man became a Christian, not a Jew, a Christian. And he saw firsthand what the core spiritual issue was. He recognized it. And it applies both to Jews and to Muslims. He was saying to himself, I see the death cult. I see why it keeps perpetuating, because all they're doing is sacrificing themselves and glorifying death and looking forward to it. The core.
One thing, I'm going to keep this really brief, 2 sentences. You say, why are Christians doing this, Jack? The American empire, and it saddens me to say this, the American empire is essentially doing all of the violence it's done across the world since, the end of World War II to now, in the name of Christianity. That's one of the things that fueled me into the anti-war movement, was seeing how much of what was done to Afghanistan and to Iraq and the people in the Middle East was done in the name of my religion. So I don't think that we can say that it's only Islam that has a violence problem. It just comes in different forms, and a lot of that does, in my opinion, and I just disagree with you. I think it's much more tied to the power dynamics at play.
I mean, I don't personally say whatsoever. I grew up reading Voice of the Martyrs magazine, and Christians were smuggling Bibles into countries around the world, delivering a gospel message to persecuted people from Pakistan to China. So growing up, I was quite familiar with all the different types of persecutions that went outside just U.S. militarism. And certainly there's some neoconservative Christians who vote for people who they think, oh, you're doing something right, you're God's messenger. And certainly they're deluded. But you're not going to find an evangelical Christian strap a bomb to their chest and blow up a school bus.
No, they just outsource it.
So
I don't think that's that much better. They just outsource it to people who have weapons of mass destruction and can do it on a much larger scale.
Well, to be fair, I don't know if they're necessarily saying that they're doing it in the name of Christianity, but they're doing it in the name of
Well, I think they're doing it in the name of American Christianity. They're doing it in a form of a specific type of Christianity.
Well, that's more of a bastardization of Christianity, if anything.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of Muslims say that what's going on with this radical Islam is a bastardization of Islam, and it has a lot to do with the fact that these are desperate people living in desperate environments. And to act like Christianity never had any expansionist times in its history is, I also think, historically incorrect. So, listen, I'm not a Muslim. I'm a religious exclusivist. I am a Christian. So I think Islam is a flawed religion. But I think that it's just convenient to be like, you know what, there are however many billion Muslims in the world. And if this was something that was just fundamentally tied to their religion, we would see a lot more violence than we do. Instead, where the Muslims are violent are where American Christians are bombing them, or where Jews are bombing them, unfortunately.
You're confusing Muslim majority countries. It's peaceful where there's occupation. If you have like in Saudi Arabia, a royal family ruling under Sharia, the conquest is complete. Of course it's peaceful if you suppress speech. Of course it's peaceful if you control women. They couldn't even drive until 2017. They still can. Of course it's peaceful if you kick out all the Jews. Of course it's peaceful if you persecute anybody who openly practices Christianity. Yeah, peaceful. That's how come this distortion exists, because it's ignored in the countries where they persecute Christians, in the countries where they persecute Hindus, or maybe it's the religious minority group of, the Sunni Shia divide. That's ignored. It's just because it's not war. It's just internal persecution. Oh, well, okay. They're just, going from Iraq, 1.5 million Christians now in 2002. Now today, 90% gone, 150,000. Nobody cares. They don't. Outside of saying, oh my gosh, the Christians have been persecuted by 90% in Iraq. No, it's not going to make the news, because they're not going to care about Christians who are having their lives destroyed in religious persecution by the government that has a Muslim majority control, because it just doesn't bleed and lead.
If we go back through history, when people were polled about who do you want to rule over this area, people used to say they wanted America to rule over them, because they actually thought that America was a great nation, that it stood for great things. Now what we have is a lot of where you do see, these brutal Islamic dictatorships. A lot of them still exist because of American interventionisms and propping up these dictatorships, maybe outside of Iran, I think a relationship with the Saudis and other areas. So I think I will grant you that there is some nuance here in terms of evaluating Islam and the role that it plays in it. But I do think that you are overly reductionist way trying to pin it primarily on that instead of primarily on the living conditions, the governments that they live under, and the effects of American foreign policy.
No, well, I can prove the counterfactual there right away. So in Kuwait, because the Palestinians there support Saddam Hussein in 91, the Kuwaiti government kicked out 300,000 Palestinians. You know that?
Yeah.
And 10,000 of them went to Lebanon. And in Lebanon right now, there's 200,000 Palestinian refugees. They don't have any rights. They can't buy land. 93% poverty rate. It's literally tent camps and squalor. Does anybody care about those people? No, they don't care that the Kuwaiti government kicked them out. Why? Because the Muslim majority thing, it doesn't bleed and lead. They'll just say, well, Saddam and then America influence, but they don't have any moral agency for the people that do violence when it's a Middle Eastern country against its own, people, to use a bad term. I don't like the collectivism, but you get the idea. So the whole gist of this is that moral agency is only assigned when it's certain people, if it's Jewish or a white American, but everybody else is just perpetually a reactionary. They're just, there's just blowback. They don't have any moral agency for if they go and massacre people or they're strap bombs to their kids. This is a terrible framing that misses the core root, and it misses the core root in such a big way because way before America ever existed was Islamic empires that conquered, quite a bit of the world violently. And the reason why there would be peace at any point is because the people who were under them had to prove that they were subjugated by paying the jizya tax, because of similitude, they
or convert,
Christian would move, or they'd have to wear a star, or not a star back then. It was a different thing, but it was a proto-star thing. So this whole idea, like they say, oh, it's peaceful, it's peaceful. Yeah, peaceful if you're enslaved, right? It's like saying this plantation is very peaceful. See, the slaves just work. They don't rise up. It's the same thing, and people don't get that because they're just so busy just hearing whatever the media is talking about, this conflict, that conflict. They don't care about all the minutia of the different Arab countries and the persecution that goes on. And
so I'll agree with you that not enough people care about all those little things. I think that is a problem that, like, I want to wake people up more to pay attention to what's going on in the world and to care about what's going on in the world. But again, I do think what's propping up a lot of these things is both directly and indirectly the consequences of American interventions in the regions historically. Again, not to say they don't have, and I'm not saying it's 100% blowback. I'm saying it is a large enough percentage, the consequence of blowback and American interference and distortions. Like I said in my opening argument, right? In the same way that when the government interferes in the economy and it creates distortions. That's, again, this is a Misesian argument, right? So I'm arguing for libertarian principles in the same way that state actions in the market create distortions, which lead to these bubbles, which leads to malincentives and malinvesting and things like that. And then those things crash. That is also what's happening in everything's economics or everything's politics. We can look at it, in that way. The same thing's happening in the realm of human interaction. States are acting, and it's creating distortions in the market of human interactions. And the state with the biggest thumbprint on the scale right now is the American empire. And then their proxy right now, unfortunately, is the Israeli state in the Middle East. And so should we move beyond that and also report on those other things going on, the other violations of rights historically in these areas and whatnot? And should we always be advocating for peace and voluntarism and libertarian ideals? Absolutely. And I'm going to be careful. I'm not trying to overly reduce it on my side to say Islam's not a factor, but and we might just have to have a hard stop and let Doug interrupt us here. But I do think you're reducing it far too much to that and not giving enough oxygen to the other aspects.
All right. Well, whether this is a hard stop or not, because this is one of those like problems of like I could go all night and I don't want to keep you guys, and I'm sure a lot of people would love to.
I'm not saying I have to go. I just said like this line of back and forth might not have an end.
I'm prefacing the fact that I have to find a way to wrap this up, and there's no way to wrap this up, which is very apropos of the topic. So this is like we don't know what to do here. Sitting from my perspective, it seems to me that both of you are right in a pretty significant extent. Jack, you are very what you're very much against is poor libertarian takes and maybe irrational or not fully thought through thinking about the issue, and maybe even abandoning some of the anti-state mentality that libertarians are born and raised on, right? And maybe get a little bit too
oh boy, I wish they were born and raised on them.
Yeah,
we're getting there. I got a fifth kid coming in July, so I'm doing my part.
Yeah. Anyway, yes. Jack, do you have any? No, are you doing your part? No.
Well, it's coming.
All right.
Later this year.
We'll leave it at that.
There'll be events.
There'll be events. Right now, just preparation. So, in any case, you are very much against bad libertarian takes, right? And the non-unique nature of Israel is sort of what you're advocating for. It's like, this is not necessarily anything new. This is how people moved. This is how refugees happened. There's always conflicts over whether or not the land was acquired legitimately, or whether any in particular settlements were, colonization or not. And yes, there's always bad actors. Israel's not special in that way. And obviously there is a unique history of why Israel was sort of settled. And I would say maybe there's something unique in some respects. But All of that seems to be a fine critique, and I don't know if it's necessarily in conflict with what Jacob has been saying. Maybe some of the history things in the narrative and stuff. What I hear, Jacob, on your side, what I'm hearing is, as an American, as a person who is very much anti-war, as a person who is very much aware now that the empire of the United States, not just at home but abroad, creates major terrible distortions, not least because it's just influence and distortions, but because it's war, but because it's it's weapons, it's violence, it's aggression on a international level. And it seems like Jack's not joining on your bandwagon on that, and is critiquing even the likes of Scott Horton, peace be upon him, right? Sorry, I couldn't resist. I said his name, had to say something. But criticizing Scott Horton, I mean, that's like stepping on lava in the room, man. But that's okay, right? I mean, we're all adults. We can all talk about this. But I don't. In some respects, I feel like in a lot of ways you're both right. And no, Israel is not, immune from criticism. And that's one thing, Jack, I would love to hear you say is, instead of critiquing the bad libertarian takes, do you have anything to say about how Israel has responded since October 7th, 2023 as a libertarian? And what would you say is like, hey, Israel's acted in a way that is or isn't in comport with libertarian principles?
Can I add one little thing to that? Like,
Sure.
we kind of missed talking about this part.
Okay.
Because he seemed to push back against the few of the quotes that I read of the Netanyahu sort of like doctrine with
Right.
supporting and propping up Hamas. And I'm not suggesting we should just blindly trust anything officials say, but like I read 2 quotes out of a list of many that I have here. I'm not saying I need to read them right now, but so I'd be curious if is he picking around the edges of my argument, or is he saying that there weren't specific policies of propping up and supporting Hamas that led to this? So if he can maybe incorporate that, kind of piggyback off that.
That makes sense, Jack?
Yeah, no, I want to actually very specifically critique that aspect. Sure, if you have that information, tell me the date that it happened, the amount of money, and who gave it and when. Give me those things. Until then, I go based off of what I have heard and seen outside, including some of my sources, including, Son of Hamas and other publications like, Wall Street Journal, where Avner Cohen was probably one of the biggest expose people on this. Because, again, the people who are reporting this otherwise, were they there? I mean, Avner Cohen apparently was a part of it. Who was actually there, right? Who was actually there? What are the names? What are the dates? What was the money? So the thing that I have specifically, again, you can look this up, Wall Street Journal, how Israel helped to spawn Hamas. But when you read the details on that are simply that Israel just allowed Hamas to be able to build its Islamic university, training camps, their schools, and other things like that. They let money come to them. So by and large, the main thing that happened was that they just simply said, oh, okay, they're going to send money to Hamas. Okay, we'll allow that. Oh, they have a charity they set up in their name to, funnel money through. We won't violently stop it. Again, there's this kind of weird dynamic here because on one hand, people are like, oh, Israel, they're bad if they stop people just trying to create schools and universities and they want to just fund their political stuff. Okay. But then if you're saying that, well, Israel helped to fund Hamas. Well, how? Well, they let Qatar send them, $10 million.
Right. No, I agree with that. But, but why did they leave
sides of the coin?
Why did they leave Hamas in power though? Like why wasn't there ever a referendum on that 2006 election? Why it's like if Hamas, like, and again, I think there's just too many. There's such an overabundance of quotes from Netanyahu and his administration talking about how, hey, we want to divide the Palestinian people. We want Hamas to be in power here, and the PLO over here in the West Bank because it divides them, and then we don't have to deal with the problem. Like, I just don't know how you can say those aren't specific policy prescriptions that contributed to October 7th.
What I'm trying to say is that Israel definitely wanted to pit Hamas against PLO, but what they're not connecting on the broader scale of things is that Hamas is getting supported by outside governments. Other governments and organizations, the wider Arab world, wanted Hamas to succeed. They wanted the radicals to succeed, to be a thorn in Israel's side, to launch attacks. So you could say Israel's stopping money, but it doesn't stop those independent moral agents from other countries and other governments saying, we want to support Hamas too, because they have their own agendas for statism. They have their own agendas for violence. So when people say Israel's doing this, I'm like, dude, it's the other countries who are funding Hamas. They're sending the weapons. They're sending the soldiers.
Israel controls Israel controls a lot of what goes into there.
Jews control everything. That's where you're going to. You eventually
Israel can, in terms of the money going in, they have the ability to stop that, and they also have well, okay, not everything, but they have the ability to stop a certain portion of it.
Well, I have a question, Jacob. What would have happened in 2006? What could have Israel done to reverse the decision in 2006?
I don't think I think the whole thing was just a bad decision. They shouldn't have been like, we're not giving you your sovereignty. You're going to be like this weird territory and kind of have your own governing authority, but not really. And like they knew that like Hamas was a terrorist group. And again, we'd have to go. This would be like this is like a 30-minute rabbit hole to go through the evidence in terms of like
you
how
can second guess what could have happened. I would push back on one hand because it seems to come up a lot when I've been studying this, which I am not at all. I'm like a 10th well versed as either of the two of you, and 1/1,000th as well versed as both of you combined. I'm terrible at math, but one thing that it keeps coming up in my mind every time there's all of this, well, this could have happened and that should have happened and they'd made this wrong decision at this point and that point, is that the state of Israel, or we could substitute Jews or just the state of Israel or whatever, is damned if you do, damned if you don't. No matter what decision it is, Israel made the bad decision. And it's almost like, and this is where I want to kind of get to maybe a little bit of the present day, and we can wrap up here in about 10 minutes, hopefully. It does seem to me that Israel is taking, and even the Netanyahu administration, they're taking a calculated risk, knowing that right now they have the ire of the world on top of them, and they are doing whatever they think is necessary in spite of it. That's a really risky move. The UN is after them, like everybody but maybe the US. I don't even know how it all breaks down in terms of like support. I know Britain might be in support, but it's actually waning over time now that it seems like it's becoming a even worse of a bad actor, ongoing. And so there's a lot to critique. And so I don't think any of us sitting here is going to say, yeah, Benjamin Netanyahu's administration and whatever the IDF has been doing has been great. Maybe the initial response is what it was, and they had to do what they had to do, and you can kind of like shrug and say, well, all right, it's like the first 2 weeks of COVID. Well, we didn't know what we were dealing with, so we had to react somehow. And you can kind of let people off. You could kind of let people. But here's the thing: nobody is saying they're doing things. So for them to say we know we're doing things that everyone else says is wrong, says something about the fact that they're just like, well, look, it doesn't matter what we do. We're just going to do what we think is right, as opposed to being like, well, if we did this, then we would appease a lot of these other people, but that doesn't seem right because we're going to just piss off the other side. And so it back to the, it doesn't matter what the Jews do, they're going to be hated for it kind of mentality. And I don't mean to make this about specifically anti-Semitism. That's just the way it came out in my sentence. But Israel can't do anything right is kind of the vibe I'm getting from just about everywhere in the news on all fronts, except for the ones that I actually don't really care about, which is like fundamentalist Christians, and for completely different reasons, which is crazy.
This is where, and I meant to bring this up earlier. This is where I'm not saying Israel is unique. Actually, when Jack said there's nothing unique going on here, well, that was kind of what I said in my opening statement. I said, when we're judging states, I think I have a consistent standard, and the fundamental basis for how I'm judging Israel is how I judge every state. And, states don't get anything right. Well, wow, it's almost like we should be anarchists. Oh, wait, we are. And so that's because states very rarely get anything right. And then it's just a matter of scale, right? So because Israel is on a very large stage and operating at a very large scale, then that might create the perception that like, oh, wow, we're saying everything they're doing is wrong. Well, I mean, I pretty much say that about my own government, and I'll pretty much say it about every other country's government. Like, find me a state where I'm like, man, they're doing a real great job. right? You're not going to hear me say that, and no one here is going to say that. So it's
we're all smiling. We're all smiling on screen. For those of you listening later and just hearing it, we're all smiling here. Of course, that's the case. Yeah. Okay, so I don't know how to wrap this up other than to give you guys just a few minutes each to sort of summarize any positions, loose ends. There is, I did have one listener or viewer write in, made a comment about the self-defense as a right of the Palestinians. And, if they're occupied, then shouldn't they be allowed to defend themselves? Jack, that's probably something you could answer. Jacob, you could speak to that as well. So I want to get to the listener who wrote in that question. Thank you. What do you think, Jack? Shouldn't Palestinians have a right to self-defense?
Yeah, 100%. And the question, though, that we're going to go next to is always look at empirical reality. Are we talking about self-defense when someone goes and I'm going to go blow up people outside a movie theater? No, that's not self-defense. Mass murdering a bunch of people is definitely escalating violence against people who are not the direct actors. If you're fighting an IDF agent who's kicking in your door because they want to squat, by all means, right? So that is a huge difference that people are missing out in this calculation, is that this type of warfare is not really between the typical things that you think about in war movies, right? It's like, oh, you have this army and then you have this army and they're fighting, blah, 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 right? We're talking about a kind of warfare that's nuts, where you have to wonder whether someone who walks into some plaza is strapped with bombs around with a bunch of, metal balls, and they're going to rip to shreds 100 people. Right? That's the kind of crazy that you're dealing with. And Israel has the Iron Dome. There's been almost 10,000 rockets shot in. Imagine if your city, right? There was 10,000 rockets shot since 2011 coming into you all the time, and you're watching it like a fireworks show. Boom, 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 boom. Right? And you're sitting there like, oh my gosh, if the Iron Dome doesn't work, one of these rockets is going to blow me to smithereens. Is that level of crazy? In what other situation would you be like, oh, okay, I hope nobody does anything about that. I hope the rockets just hit, right? You'd be crazy, right? And we want a private market defense where we can do things better than that and not just have the Israeli government work, on that issue. But to pretend as if this is something that is anything other than a crazy, unique situation in terms of the conflict, the nature of the violence that's there, in terms of the struggle, it's just incomparable. And that's why people need this kind of long history. That's why they need the bigger picture about the ideologies and what's really going on. And at the end, a reminder that the goal should be about having peace by de-escalation, property rights, moving toward respect of individuals, doing restitution as best as possible. Obviously, it's never going to be perfect. There's just different people in different times. They're dead since, 1948, and it's their grandkids or whatever who are around. It's not going to be neat in that way. So we don't control it. We're just here talking ideas, but we want people here to not get lost in the collectivism, not grow hate against a group of people, not grow, all different types of these, I just want this government to just destroy these people. We don't want that psychology as an outcome. We want actual peace. So we want love and understanding and moving away from the ideologies that are about a death cult.
Jacob, thoughts on the self-defense of the Palestinians?
Yeah, I mean, so October 7th was not self-defense. That was an attack. Palestinians have a right to self-defense, yes. And blowback isn't the same. Saying something's blowback doesn't mean it's always morally justified, right? 9/11 was blowback. None of the people who died on 9/11, though, deserved to die. It was still a violation of the non-aggression principle. So, again, like I've said before, Hamas is terrible, and I want to provide no cover for them at all. And so I want to be very careful to draw that line between, Palestinians have a right to self-defense, but Hamas's actions are not self-defense. They are unfortunately operating, though, in similar fashion to what states do, which is states don't engage in a libertarian self-defense. They often just trade innocent casualties for innocent casualties, and that's part of the problem. Jack brought up an interesting point with the Iron Dome, and he kind of went where I was going when he brought that up. The problem with the Iron Dome is that socialized defense, and it is kind of crazy to be like, hey, all these bombs are coming in. I believe the Iron Dome's taking care of it, so I guess we don't have to worry. You're like, who would think that? It's like, well, that's basically been kind of the policy of Israel. So again, not trying to pick on Israel, because all states and all socialism make bad decisions because they're not operating on proper incentives. But yeah, it is kind of crazy. Kind of crazy to be like, hey, let's lock a bunch of people up into this little tiny area. Let's, assist in the formation of a terrorist group having power over them. And then instead of like, I don't know, finding a way to resolve this, keep them there and just let this socialized defense system keep us safe and nothing bad's going to happen. And it didn't work. And then the predictable blowback finally had its day. And so, and that's where I'd say, it does seem like we are aligned. The solution is rejecting socialism. The solution is rejecting statism. And, the more governments move towards a libertarian order as opposed to a statist order, the less mistakes they're going to make. But if we're going to say Israel's government needs to move towards a libertarian order, well, then they need to say, hey, there's a bunch of people living this little land that we basically have sovereignty over, and they don't have rights, and we are definitely to a large extent responsible for the trauma that they suffered, and we need to do the best job we can in rectifying that situation. And it's not going to be perfect. But that's the only path forward is to find some kind of peace. And every day that goes by that they aren't moving that direction is just, more building up towards future blowback. I mean, listen, like Pat Buchanan brought this up like 15 years ago. He was like, when they were bombing Gaza back then, he's like, in like 12, 13 years, the kids growing up there are going to be terrorists. And yeah, it's kind of what happened. It's a very vicious cycle. And so something needs to be done about it. And maybe what Jack said is right. People need to, exhibit that kind of Christ-like response to be like, you know what, we aren't gonna, the Israeli government, and I'm not blaming the people, but the people need to realize this and demand a libertarian government over them, not a statist one, and say, you know what, like, we're not going to overcome evil with evil. That's what the Bible says, right? Like, instead we have to overcome evil with good. And so that's a good answer, I think.
All right, Jack, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to say I love Jacob's closing remark there. You don't want to fight evil with evil. We're trying to actually shift things toward good and toward love and compassion in a way that is not escalating statist violence or swinging the pendulum back over and be like, oh, well, we want this group instead to rule, and magically with democracy we'll have less violence, right? We're moving away from those solutions. And I think, again, I just cannot recommend enough this book, Son of Hamas by Masab Hassan Youssef. He himself became Christian, and he just gives an incredible contextualization because he has both the Hamas side and the IDF side when he was a double agent later in life, and then he quit that and it's like, I'm done, and then he became Christian. I just think it's a fantastic read to help contextualize it. He doesn't downplay Israeli violence, he doesn't downplay Hamas's violence, but he does give a really incredible Christian perspective on the psychologies underpinning everything, and gives a great, call to action for people to think differently. So,
Jacob, were those your final remarks? You cool with that? I'm sure I know you have 3 hours worth of material to keep going on. I don't have that time.
Listen, Doug, you're going to have to use your free market principles here and decide what doors you want to open and close. Okay.
I know, right? Well, I think I could say for the three of us, we enjoyed this conversation. I think it was helpful for me, especially because I've been seeing the interactions online a bit. Although I did give up Facebook for Lent on my phone, so I'm not quite as active. Because it was such a terrible habit. So we joined a live room here so that we can talk about it. It was really great for me to hear you guys talk about your different sides. And at the end of the day, in some ways, there's that Venn diagram, and there's a lot of overlap, right? It's not just a narrow overlap, because we are committed anarchist libertarians, and so, in some ways, to me, it seems like there's a little bit of a focus. There's obviously some disagreement over some facts, history, narrative, and those kinds of things. I can't imagine that we won't have a further conversation about this in the future. And but I want to thank you both. I want to thank those who joined, those who chimed in the comments field. Keep sharing it. If you are wanting to listen to this, you'll listen to it on the LCI Greenroom podcast feed. And of course, you can also watch it on any of the live stream options. So Jack, Jacob, thank you for being here to have this conversation.
Of course. Thank
It's been
you.
my pleasure.